June 15, 1944. The small village of Aldenhoven, 20 kilometers northeast of Aachen, Germany. Rain pelted against the windows of the Müller family home as Gerhard Müller paced in his study, furious about his daughter's latest act of defiance. Helga Müller, 26 years old and weighing over 200 kilograms, sat silently in the corner, her eyes downcast as her father plotted her future. The Müller patriarch believed his punishment would break his daughter's spirit and teach a captured American airman the meaning of humiliation. Little did he know that his cruel scheme would transform into one of the war's most unexpected love stories. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how hatred intended to punish two people deemed undesirable by society instead created a bond that would survive the most devastating conflict in human history and challenge the very foundations of prejudice. Friedrich Müller, a local government official with strong connections to the German leadership of the time, had always been embarrassed by his daughter Helga. In a society that prized physical fitness and idealized body standards, Helga's weight had made her an object of ridicule and scorn. Despite having a brilliant mind, she spoke 4 languages fluently and had studied literature at university in Berlin before the war. Her father saw only her size. Her mother, Elsa Müller, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving Helga without her only ally in the household. "You bring shame to this family," Friedrich bellowed, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged study. "Your disobedience cannot continue. I have found a way to make you useful to the fatherland." Helga had been caught smuggling extra rations to starving children in the village, taking from supplies her father hoarded through his position. This final act of defiance had pushed him over the edge. In another part of Germany, at Stalag Luft 3 in Sagan, a young American bombardier named Thomas Jenkins from Appleton, Wisconsin, was trying to adjust to life as a prisoner of war. Shot down over Hamburg during his 4th mission with the 8th Air Force, Jenkins had managed to bail out of his burning B-17 Flying Fortress before it crashed. 3 of his crew members had not been so fortunate. 6 months, Jenkins said to his bunkmate, Second Lieutenant Robert Daniels. "Half a year in this place." Daniels nodded sympathetically. "Could be worse. At least we're not in the Pacific. I heard those camps are much harsher." Jenkins was 24 years old, a former high school mathematics teacher who had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. Slim and bookish, with wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual appearance, he had never quite fit the military mold. His fellow airmen had nicknamed him Professor for his habit of reciting poetry during long missions to calm his nerves. Major William Simmons, the senior American officer in their barracks, gathered the men for an announcement. "I have been informed that 10 men will be transferred tomorrow to a work detail. The Germans claim it's agricultural work, helping local farmers whose sons are at the front." A murmur ran through the gathered prisoners. "I don't like it," Simmons continued, "but I've been assured this falls within Geneva Convention guidelines. The following men have been selected." He began reading names from a list. When Jenkins heard his name called, a cold feeling settled in his stomach. Separations like this rarely boded well. The next morning, Jenkins and 9 other prisoners were loaded onto a transport truck. They traveled for 2 days, moving westward toward the Rhine. Finally, they arrived at Aldenhoven, where they were split up and assigned to different farms and businesses in need of labor. Jenkins was delivered to the Müller estate, a large property on the outskirts of town. Friedrich Müller greeted him with cold disdain. "American," he said in accented English, looking Jenkins up and down, "you will work here, under my supervision. You will help with the harvest and maintenance. You will obey all orders without question." Jenkins nodded, maintaining the dignified silence he had been taught during POW training. "Show no fear, give only name, rank, and serial number when questioned. First Lieutenant Thomas Jenkins, serial number 112785542, he stated mechanically. Friedrich smirked. "That will not be necessary. You are not being interrogated. You are here to work, and," his smile turned cruel, "to serve as companion to my daughter." Jenkins was confused by this statement until later that evening when he was brought to the dining room. There sat Helga Müller, enormous in a dress that strained at the seams, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her blue eyes showing a mixture of humiliation and anger. "This is my daughter Helga," Friedrich announced. "You will take your meals with her. You will accompany her on her walks. You will be her devoted companion." The way he emphasized the word made its mockery clear. Perhaps the company of an enemy soldier will finally teach her the proper respect for our values. From across the table, Helga glared at her father. "This is cruel even for you," she said in perfect English. Friedrich seemed pleased by her discomfort. "You will both learn your lessons," he replied, then left them alone, a guard posted outside the door. An awkward silence filled the room. Jenkins stood uncomfortably until Helga gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit, Lieutenant Jenkins. I apologize for my father's behavior." Jenkins sat slowly. "You speak excellent English," he said, searching for something neutral to say. "I studied English literature at Humboldt University," she replied. "Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dickens. I had planned to become a professor before all this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the war, her situation, everything. "I was a mathematics teacher," Jenkins offered, "in Wisconsin." A ghost of a smile appeared on Helga's face. "Then we are both educators, trapped in a world gone mad." That first dinner passed in stilted conversation. Jenkins was wary, suspecting this might be some elaborate form of psychological manipulation. Helga was defensive, expecting mockery or disgust from the American. Captain Howard Miller, the American officer who had been briefly held at the local police station before being assigned to work at the town's mill, encountered Jenkins the next day when both were collecting water from the town square. "How's your assignment?" Miller asked quietly, glancing at the guards who stood at a distance. "Strange," Jenkins replied. "I've been assigned as some kind of companion to the local official's daughter. I think it's meant as punishment for both of us." Miller raised an eyebrow. "What did you do to deserve punishment?" "Existed," Jenkins said with a shrug. "She's very overweight. Her father seems to think forcing her to spend time with an enemy soldier is humiliating." "Watch yourself," Miller warned. "These psychological games can be dangerous. Don't let your guard down." Jenkins nodded. But as he returned to the Müller estate, he found himself thinking about the sadness he had seen in Helga's eyes. The following weeks established a routine. Jenkins worked in the fields during the day, harvesting potatoes and tending to the estate's vegetable garden under guard. In the evenings, he was cleaned up and brought to dine with Helga. Friedrich often joined them, clearly enjoying the discomfort of both his prisoners. Sergeant Dieter Hoffmann, the guard assigned to Jenkins, was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost his left foot to frostbite during the first winter in Russia. His wooden prosthetic caused him to walk with a distinctive clunk that announced his presence. "Your American is causing no trouble," Hoffmann reported to Friedrich one evening, 3 weeks into Jenkins' stay. "He works hard and says little." "And the humiliation of dining with my daughter?" Friedrich asked eagerly. Hoffmann hesitated. "They talk, Herr Müller, about books and such things." Friedrich frowned. This was not the result he had anticipated. Indeed, Jenkins and Helga had discovered a shared love of literature. During their enforced time together, they had begun discussing favorite authors and works. Jenkins had recited poetry he had memorized, and Helga had responded with German poems, translating them line by line. "Rilke is difficult to translate," she explained one evening. "The cadence of German gives his work a different music." "Try," Jenkins encouraged. "I'd like to hear it in both languages." When Helga recited Autumn Day first in German and then in her own English translation, Jenkins was moved by the beauty of the language and her evident passion for the work. It was the first time he had seen her truly animated, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Dr. Wilhelm Bauer, the town physician who came weekly to check on the health of the POWs assigned to local work details, noticed the change in Helga during his visit in early July. "You seem more cheerful than I've seen you in years," he commented as he checked her blood pressure. Helga shrugged. "I have someone to talk to who doesn't judge me solely by my appearance." Dr. Bauer, who had known Helga since childhood, smiled sadly. "Your father's attempt at cruelty may have backfired." "He doesn't see it," Helga replied. "He cannot imagine anyone finding value in me beyond my size." In his weekly letter home, which would be heavily censored before delivery, Jenkins wrote carefully to his parents, "My work assignment is on a farm estate. The daughter of the house is an educated woman who speaks excellent English. Our conversations about literature help pass the time and remind me of my classroom days. Please don't worry about me. I am being treated according to the Geneva Convention." What he couldn't write was how those conversations had become the bright spot in his captivity, how Helga's intelligence and wit had surprised and delighted him, how her laughter at his stories of teaching mishaps had transformed her face, revealing a beauty he had not initially seen. Colonel Werner Schmidt, the local military commander who occasionally visited Friedrich Müller for dinner, observed the American prisoner and Helga with curiosity. "Your experiment seems to have unexpected results," he commented to Friedrich as they shared brandy after one such dinner. "They appear almost friendly." Friedrich dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "A pretense. The American is merely being polite to ensure better treatment, and Helga is so desperate for attention she would befriend anyone." Schmidt was not convinced. "Be careful, Friedrich. Your daughter speaks English very well. They could be exchanging information." This suggestion alarmed Friedrich, who immediately instituted a new rule. All conversations between Jenkins and Helga must be in German only, which Friedrich understood and must remain audible to the guard at all times. Jenkins' German was rudimentary at best. He had picked up a few phrases during his time as a prisoner, but was far from fluent. This new restriction threatened to end the literary discussions that had become so important to both of them. Helga, however, was resourceful. She began teaching Jenkins German under the guise of helping him better understand work instructions. Each day, she would introduce new vocabulary related to farming, literature, and everyday objects. "Der Apfel," she would say, holding up an apple from the harvest. "Der Apfel," Jenkins would repeat carefully. "Gut," Helga would respond with a smile. "Now use it in a sentence." Through this daily language instruction, their bond continued to grow. Jenkins was an apt pupil, eager to learn. By August, he could carry on basic conversations in German, much to Friedrich's annoyance. The lessons had undermined his attempt to isolate them from each other. Frau Greta Schmidt, the colonel's wife who sometimes accompanied her husband to the Müller estate, noticed the transformation in Helga. "You've lost weight," she commented during one visit, studying Helga's face. "And you've done something different with your hair." Helga touched the loose braid that had replaced her severe bun. "I've been walking more," she replied simply. "The summer weather is pleasant." What she didn't say was that these walks, always with Jenkins and a guard trailing behind, had become precious opportunities for whispered English conversations beyond Friedrich's hearing. During these walks through the estate's orchards, they shared personal stories. Jenkins told her about his childhood in Appleton, his parents' small bookstore, his decision to become a teacher, and his reluctant enlistment after Pearl Harbor. He described his 4 bombing missions before being shot down, his terror as his plane caught fire, the relief of his parachute opening, and the surreal moment of capture on a German farm field. Helga shared her own stories, her mother's kindness and early death from cancer, her father's escalating cruelty, her university days in Berlin, where she had briefly found acceptance among fellow literary scholars, and her return home when the war began. She spoke of her small acts of resistance, extra food smuggled to Jewish families before they disappeared from the village, hidden radio broadcasts listened to in secret. "If my father knew half of what I've done, he would have me arrested," she confessed during one walk. "Sometimes I think that's what he hopes for, an excuse to be rid of me entirely." Sergeant Kurt Weber, a young soldier newly assigned to guard duty at the Müller estate after Hoffmann was reassigned, reported to Friedrich with concern. "Sir, the American and Fräulein Müller walk very close together. They whisper things I cannot hear." Friedrich's rage was immediate. The walks were suspended. Jenkins was confined to a small shed on the property when not working. Helga was restricted to the house. Despite these new limitations, they found ways to communicate. Maria Kraus, the elderly cook who had been with the Müller family since before Helga's birth, carried notes between them, hidden in Jenkins' meal tray. "Be careful," Maria warned Helga. "Your father suspects something. He has forbidden me to allow you in the kitchen when I prepare the Americans' meals. Helga pressed a folded paper into Maria's hand. Just one more note. Please, Maria. The cook sighed but took the paper. Her affection for Helga, whom she had helped raise after Elsa's death, overcame her fear of Friedrich. The note contained a passage from Pride and Prejudice that Helga had copied out. In vain have I struggled. It will not do, my feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. When Jenkins received this literary declaration, his heart raced. Was Helga merely sharing a favorite passage, or was there more to her choice? He wrote back with lines from Whitman. We were together. I forget the rest. By September, as Allied forces pushed eastward through France following the Normandy landings, the atmosphere in Aldenhoven grew tense. News of German retreats was officially suppressed, but rumors spread through whispers and hidden radio broadcasts. Professor Heinrich Wagner, a retired history teacher who had once taught Helga and now lived in seclusion due to his private opposition to the regime, visited the Miller home under the pretense of returning borrowed books. Things are changing rapidly, he murmured to Helga when they had a moment alone. Your American friend may soon have compatriots arriving in uniform rather than as prisoners. Helga's eyes widened. How soon? Wagner shook his head. Impossible to say with certainty. Weeks, perhaps months. But preparations are being made. Some officials are already sending their families eastward. This information added urgency to Helga's feelings. If liberation was coming, what would become of her connection with Jenkins? Would he return to America and forget their time together? Friedrich Müller had indeed begun preparing for changing circumstances. His office was filled with burning documents, and locked cases were being loaded into his personal vehicle. His loyalties had placed him in a precarious position, should the Americans arrive. Captain James Wilson, the senior American officer among the POWs in Aldenhoven, managed to gather his men for a clandestine meeting at the mill, where several worked. Intelligence passed through the underground suggests we should prepare for liberation, he informed them quietly. If fighting reaches this area, find cover and stay put. Don't try to escape during active combat. Jenkins absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Freedom beckoned, but what of Helga? On October 4th, 1944, Friedrich Müller made a decision. He would leave for Berlin the following day, where he had connections who could help him establish a new identity, if necessary. Helga would be brought along despite her resistance. Pack one suitcase, he ordered her. We leave at dawn. I won't go, Helga replied, standing firm in the study doorway. Friedrich's face darkened. You have no choice, unless you prefer I turn you over to the authorities for your treasonous activities. Oh yes, he added, seeing her surprise. I know about the radio, the extra rations you've distributed, and your disgusting infatuation with the enemy. Helga felt cold fear wash over her. How? Young Weber is very observant, Friedrich said with a cruel smile. He found your notes. Quite poetic. Your treason. That night, as the household settled into uneasy sleep, Helga made her own decision. With Maria's help, she unlocked the shed where Jenkins was kept. We must hurry, she whispered as she opened the door. My father knows everything. He's leaving for Berlin tomorrow and forcing me to go with him. Jenkins stepped out into the moonlight, blinking. Where can we go? Professor Wagner will hide us, Helga explained. He has a cellar that has concealed others before. As they crept across the darkened estate grounds, Sergeant Weber emerged from the shadows, his rifle raised. Stop, he commanded. Fräulein Müller, return to the house immediately. Jenkins stepped in front of Helga protectively. Please, he said in his improved German, let us pass. Weber's young face showed conflict. At 19, he had been drafted from school directly into service. The fanaticism of his early training had faded after seeing the reality of the war. My duty, he began uncertainly. Your duty to humanity outweighs your duty to a failing regime, Helga said quietly. You know what my father represents. Is that what you're fighting for? After a long, tense moment, Weber lowered his rifle. I will report that you overpowered me, he said. You have until morning before they come looking. They thanked him and continued into the night. Helga's sighs made their progress slow, and Jenkins supported her as they made their way through fields toward the village. Professor Wagner was startled, but not surprised when they arrived at his door. "I have been expecting something like this," he admitted as he ushered them inside, though perhaps not quite so dramatically or so soon. The professor's cellar was small but secure, having been specially modified with a hidden entrance behind a bookcase. For the next several days, Helga and Jenkins remained concealed there, while Friedrich Müller raged through the town with military police searching for them. Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson, an American intelligence officer, who would later document unusual civilian POW interactions during the European campaign, would write of the Müller-Jenkins case, "Among the more than 100,000 American POWs held in Germany, there were several dozen documented cases of romantic attachments forming with German citizens, despite official prohibitions." The case of Lieutenant Jenkins and Helga Müller stands out for both the unusual circumstances of their meeting and the documented brutality of Friedrich Müller's intentions. In the cellar hideaway, by the light of a single candle, Jenkins and Helga finally spoke openly of their feelings without the constraint of notes or whispers. "I never expected to find someone who would see past." Helga gestured at her body. Jenkins took her hand. "I see you, your mind, your courage, your heart. The rest is just packaging." When Helga laughed at this description, Jenkins felt a warmth that had nothing to do with their close quarters. "I'm serious," he continued. "Where I come from, we have a saying, 'Don't judge a book by its cover.' A saying we would do well to remember in all aspects of life," Professor Wagner commented as he brought them their evening meal of thin soup and bread. "Perhaps if more had looked beyond appearances and propaganda, we would not be hiding in cellars while the world burns." After a week in hiding, Wagner brought news that Friedrich Müller had departed for Berlin after failing to locate them. "Their search has been called off," he reported. "The military has more pressing concerns with American forces approaching from the west." The relative safety allowed Helga and Jenkins to emerge from the cellar and move into the professor's spare room. Though still in danger if discovered, they settled into a strange domestic routine, helping Wagner with household tasks and continuing their literary discussions, now including the professor. During this period, Jenkins began writing a manuscript that combined poetry and prose, documenting their unusual love story. Using paper provided by Wagner, he filled pages with reflections on captivity, freedom, and unexpected connections. "Love in Captivity," he titled the collection, which would later be published to critical acclaim in 1952. On October 17th, American reconnaissance units reached the outskirts of Aldenhoven. The fighting was minimal, as most German forces had withdrawn to more defensible positions further east. By evening, the village was under American control. Captain Wilson, the senior POW who had remained in the village, directed liberating forces to various locations where Americans were held. A squad led by Sergeant Frank Rodriguez was dispatched to Professor Wagner's home after local information suggested Americans might be sheltered there. When Rodriguez knocked on the door, Wagner answered calmly. "We've been expecting you," he said in accented English. "There is an American officer here, and 2 German civilians who have helped him." Jenkins emerged from the back room, still thin from months of captivity but standing tall. The reunion with American forces was emotional, with handshakes and backslaps from the liberating soldiers. "And who are these civilians?" Rodriguez asked, noting Helga, who stood nervously in the doorway. "This is Helga Müller, who risked her life to help me escape," Jenkins explained, "and Professor Heinrich Wagner, who sheltered us both." The American handling of German civilians who had assisted Allied personnel was generally positive but complicated by military regulations. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thompson, the civil affairs officer assigned to Aldenhoven, interviewed both Helga and Wagner extensively. "Under normal circumstances, fraternization with German civilians is strictly prohibited," Thompson explained to Jenkins privately. "However, there are exceptions for those who demonstrably assisted Allied personnel at risk to themselves." The documentation process took several weeks, during which Jenkins was technically repatriated, but requested and received special permission to remain in Aldenhoven to help with translation and civilian relations due to his improved German. During this period, Jenkins learned that 2 of his crewmates, whom he had believed deceased, had actually survived and were in POW camps now being liberated. The navigator, Lieutenant Michael Chen, was located in a camp near Munich, while the radio operator, Sergeant David Goldstein, had been held near Frankfurt. Their eventual reunion in November was captured by an army photographer, the image later appearing in Stars and Stripes with the caption, "Crew of Literary Lady reunited after months in German captivity." The nickname of their B-17 had been inspired by Jenkins' habit of painting literary quotations on bombs, an unusual practice that had amused his crew. As Allied forces consolidated control and began occupation duties, the question of Jenkins and Helga's relationship became more pressing. Military regulations prohibited marriages between U.S. personnel and German nationals during the initial occupation period, a rule designed to prevent impulsive decisions during emotionally charged times. Colonel Henry Williams, Jenkins' new commanding officer, called him in for a private discussion in late November. "Your situation is unusual, Lieutenant," Williams acknowledged. "I've reviewed the statements from Professor Wagner and others in the village about how Miss Müller helped you at great personal risk. That counts for a lot." Jenkins waited, hoping for understanding. "However," Williams continued, "regulations are clear. No marriages to German nationals are permitted at this time. When you rotate back to the States, which will happen within the month given your POW status, she cannot accompany you." Jenkins had anticipated this, but still felt the blow heavily. "What are the long-term prospects, sir?" Williams sighed. "Once the initial occupation period stabilizes and civilian travel resumes, there will likely be provisions for fiancés and spouses. But that could be a year or more." The news devastated Helga when Jenkins relayed it to her that evening in Professor Wagner's parlor, where she continued to stay, her father's property having been requisitioned for military use. "A year," she repeated quietly. "So much can change in a year." Jenkins knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "My feelings won't change. I'll go back, get discharged, and start the paperwork immediately. I'll write every day." Professor Wagner, who had been grading papers in the corner, spoke up. "Perhaps there is another option. Lieutenant Jenkins, your military service will conclude soon, yes?" Jenkins nodded. "Once I'm processed through the repatriation system. But civilian employment with the occupation authorities might be possible," Wagner suggested. "Your German is improving, and translators are desperately needed. This could allow you to remain in Europe while maintaining legal status." The possibility brought hope. Jenkins immediately began inquiries through military channels about civilian employment opportunities with the occupation government. Major Elizabeth Harrison, a Women's Army Corps officer assigned to civilian liaison duties, became an unexpected ally. Having heard their story through the efficient military grapevine, she approached Jenkins with practical advice. "The Civilian Translator Corps is desperately understaffed," she informed him. "With your teaching background and improving German, you'd be an ideal candidate. It would mean remaining in Germany for at least a year, but—" "That's exactly what I want," Jenkins interrupted eagerly. Harrison smiled. "I thought it might be. I'll put in a recommendation." Through Harrison's assistance and his own persistence, Jenkins secured a position as a civilian translator, with the occupation government beginning in January 1945, after his official military discharge. This position allowed him to remain in Germany legally, while the bureaucratic process for bringing Helga to America could begin. During this period, Helga underwent her own transformation. The security and happiness of her relationship with Jenkins, combined with the increased physical activity and normalized food portions of post-war Germany, led to significant weight loss. By spring of 1945, she had lost nearly 70 kilograms. Dr. Bauer, continuing as the town physician under American supervision, noted this change during a checkup. "Your health has improved remarkably," he observed, "but more importantly, you seem at peace with yourself." Helga smiled. "For the first time in my life, I'm valued for who I am, not judged for how I appear." Friedrich Müller's fate became known in March 1945, when his name appeared on a list of officials detained in Berlin. Facing war crimes charges for his role in local deportations, he would eventually be sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. When informed of her father's detention, Helga showed little emotion. "He made his choices," she said simply. "As did I." The bureaucratic process for bringing German fiancés to America was complex and lengthy, but Jenkins worked tirelessly to navigate it. By October 1945, they had received preliminary approval, conditional upon immigration interviews and medical examinations. Captain Wilson, now serving with the Occupation Administration in Frankfurt, reunited with Jenkins during this period. "I hardly recognized you," Wilson said, noting Jenkins' civilian clothes and confident demeanor. "Married life seems to agree with you." "Not officially married yet," Jenkins clarified, "but soon, we hope." Wilson shook his head in amazement. "When I think how this all started, as some cruel joke by her father. Talk about plans backfiring." The official immigration interview took place in Frankfurt in November 1945. Immigration officer Stanley Morris reviewed their case with professional detachment. "You understand, Miss Muller, that by marrying an American citizen and emigrating, you will be starting an entirely new life," Morris stated. "Your educational credentials may not be recognized, and you will face certain prejudices as a German national." Helga nodded. "I understand the challenges, Mr. Morris, but I have already lived through the worst that prejudice can offer. American prejudice cannot be more painful than what I experienced in my own home." Morris, a veteran himself, seemed moved by their story. "Your application has been approved," he announced. "Once the marriage is performed, the immigration visa will be issued." Their wedding took place on December 18, 1945, in the Aldenhoven village church, now partially rebuilt after damage from artillery fire. Professor Wagner gave the bride away. Captain Wilson served as best man. Major Harrison attended as matron of honor. The ceremony was conducted in both German and English by the village pastor and an American chaplain. The local children, many of whom Helga had secretly helped during the war years, scattered flowers as they exited the church. Maria Krause, the cook who had carried their secret notes, wept openly with joy. Sergeant Weber, who had allowed their escape and subsequently served a brief detention for dereliction of duty, attended in civilian clothes, his military service concluded. He approached them at the small reception held in Professor Wagner's home. "I made the right choice that night," he said simply, shaking Jenkins' hand. In January 1946, Thomas and Helga Jenkins boarded a transport ship in Bremerhaven bound for New York. With them were 2 suitcases containing clothing, books, and the manuscript that would later become Love in Captivity. Professor Alfred Schmidt, a historian who documented unusual wartime relationships for his 1972 book, Unexpected Bonds, Love During Wartime, would write, "The Jenkins case represents a profound irony of war, that in attempting to use human connection as punishment, Friedrich Müller inadvertently created the conditions for one of the most well-documented and enduring love stories to emerge from the European conflict. What began as cruelty transformed into a testament to the human capacity to recognize worth beyond physical appearance or national identity." The Jenkins arrived in Appleton, Wisconsin, in February 1946. Thomas's parents, who had corresponded with Helga during the immigration process, welcomed them with open arms. The local newspaper, the Appleton Post, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Local Boy Returns with German Bride, a Love Story Amid War." Thomas resumed teaching mathematics at Appleton High School, while Helga initially worked as a German language tutor. In 1948, she was hired as a language instructor at Lawrence College, later Lawrence University, eventually becoming a full professor of German and comparative literature. Their first child, Eleanor, was born in 1947, followed by Robert in 1949. Both would grow up bilingual, with summer visits to Professor Wagner in Germany, establishing a connection to their mother's homeland, even as they fully embraced their American identity. The publication of Love in Captivity in 1952 brought national attention to their story. Thomas and Helga appeared on several radio programs and were featured in Life magazine with a photo spread showing their American suburban life, Helga in the garden with the children, Thomas grading papers at the dining room table, the family at church on Sunday. When asked about her dramatic physical transformation during these interviews, Helga always redirected the conversation. "The weight I carried was as much emotional as physical," she would explain. "Being truly seen and valued allowed me to shed both." Thomas would add, "I fell in love with Helga's mind and spirit first. The changes in her appearance were simply a reflection of her finding peace with herself." In 1965, they returned to Aldenhoven for the first time, bringing their teenage children to see where their improbable love story began. The Müller estate had long since been converted into a community center. Professor Wagner, now in his 80s, still lived in the same house where he had sheltered them. The elderly Maria Kraus wept again upon seeing them. "I knew," she told Helga in German, "even back then, I knew this was true love." Sergeant Weber, now a successful businessman in Cologne, traveled to Aldenhoven specifically to meet with them. Over dinner at the local inn, he confessed, "Your story has been my moral compass all these years. Whenever I face a difficult decision, I ask myself, what is the truly human choice, not just the expected one?" In 1975, for their 30th anniversary, Thomas and Helga established a scholarship fund at Lawrence University for students who demonstrate the ability to see beyond conventional perspectives. The fund continues to provide educational opportunities today. When Thomas passed away in 1989 at age 69, Helga continued their shared commitment to education and understanding. She completed his final book, Mathematics of the Heart, Finding Patterns in Human Connection, adding her own literary perspective to his mathematical frameworks. Before her own passing in 2003, Helga donated their correspondence, manuscripts, and wartime documents to the National World War II Museum, where they form the core of an exhibit on humanity amid conflict. Dr. Elizabeth Chen Williams, granddaughter of Lieutenant Michael Chen from Jenkins' original flight crew, and now a professor of history at Stanford University, perhaps best summarized their legacy. The Jenkins story reminds us that even in our darkest historical moments, the human capacity for connection can transcend the artificial boundaries we create. What Friedrich Müller failed to understand was that true worth has never been measured by physical appearance, nationality, or conformity to societal expectations. In trying to punish two people he deemed unworthy, he inadvertently created the conditions for one of the war's most powerful testaments to human dignity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.